of American society and created a kind of a psychological environment in which the government is able to intervene, in part through fiscal policies, in part through public work and public services, but very largely, of course, through defense spending. In this way, to use Alfred Chandler's words, the government acts as a coordinator of last resort when managers are unable to maintain a high level of aggregate demand. As another conservative business historian, Joseph Monson, writes, enlightened corporate managers, far from fearing government intervention in the economy, view the new economics as a technique for increasing corporate viability. Of course, the most cynical use of these ideas is by the managers of the publicly subsidized war industries. There was a remarkable series in the Washington Post about this about a year ago by Bernard Nossiter. For example, he quoted Samuel Downer, financial vice president of LTV Aerospace, one of the big new conglomerates, who explained why the post-war world must be bolstered by military orders. He said, it's basic. Its selling appeal is defense of the home. This is one of the greatest appeals the politicians have to adjusting the system. If you're the president and you need a control factor in the economy and you need to sell this factor, you can't sell Harlem and Watts, but you can sell self-preservation, a new environment. We're going to increase defense budgets as long as those bastards in Russia are ahead of us. The American people understand this. Of course, those bastards aren't exactly ahead of us in this deadly and cynical game, but that's only a minor embarrassment to the thesis. In times of need, we can always follow Dean Rusk, Hubert Humphrey, and other luminaries and appeal to the billion Chinese armed to the teeth and setting out on world conquest. Again, I want to emphasize the role in this system of the Cold War as a technique of domestic control, technique for developing the psychological climate of paranoia and psychosis in which the taxpayer will be willing to provide an enormous, endless subsidy to the technologically advanced sectors of American industry and the corporations that dominate this increasingly centralized system. Well, of course, perfectly obvious that Russian imperialism is not an invention of American ideologists. It's real enough to the Hungarians or the Czechs, for example. What is an invention is the uses to which it's put. For example, by Dean Acheson in 1950 or Walt Rostow a decade later, when they pretend that the Vietnam War is an example of Russian imperialism, or by the Johnson administration in 1965, when it justifies the Dominican intervention with reference to the Sino-Soviet military bloc, or by the Kennedy intellectuals, who, as Townsend Hoops put it in an article in the Washington Monthly last month, were deluded by the tensions of the Cold War years and could not perceive that the triumph of the national revolution in Vietnam would not be a triumph for Moscow and Peking, which is a most remarkable degree of delusion on the part of presumably literate men. Or, for example, by Eugene Rostow, who in a recent book that was very widely praised by liberal senators and academic intellectuals outlined the series of challenges to world order in the modern era as follows. Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, Hitler, and continuing in the post-war world, general strikes in France and Italy, the Civil War in Greece, and the attack on South Vietnam, where, he writes in 1968, Russia has put us to severe tests in its efforts to spread communism by the sword. Now, there's a very interesting series of challenges to world order. Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, Hitler, general strikes in France and Italy, the Civil War in Greece, and the Russian attack on South Vietnam. If one thinks it through, he can reach some pretty interesting conclusions about modern history. Well, one can continue with this indefinitely. I mean to suggest that the Cold War is highly functional, both to the American elite and its Soviet counterpart, who in a perfectly similar way exploit Western imperialism, which they did not invent, as they send their armies into Czechoslovakia. It's important in both cases in providing an ideology for empire and for the government-subsidized system here of military capitalism. It's predictable, then, that challenges to this ideology will be bitterly resisted by force if necessary. Now, in many ways, American society is indeed open, and liberal values are preserved. However, as poor people and black people and other ethnic minorities know very well, the liberal veneer is pretty thin. Mark Twain once wrote that it is by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice either of them. Those who lack the prudence may well pay the cost. Roughly speaking, I think it's accurate to say that a corporate elite of managers and owners governs the economy and the political system as well the political system as well, at least in very large measure. The people, so-called, do exercise an occasional choice among those who Marx once called the rival factions and adventurers of the ruling class. And those who find this characterization too harsh may prefer the formulations of a modern democratic theorist like Joseph Schumpeter, who describes modern political democracy, favorably, as a system in which the deciding of issues by the electorate is secondary to the election of the men who are to do the deciding. A political party, he says, accurately, is a group whose members propose to act in concert in the competitive struggle for political power. If that were not so, it would be impossible for different parties to adopt exactly or almost exactly the same program. That's all the advantages of political democracy as he sees it. This program that both parties adopt, more or less exactly, and the individuals who compete for power, they express a narrow conservative ideology, basically the interests of one or other element in the corporate elite, with some modifications. Now, this is obviously no conspiracy. I think it's simply implicit in the system of corporate capitalism. These people and the institutions they represent are, in effect, in power, and their interests are the national interest. It's this interest that is served primarily and overwhelmingly by the overseas empire and the growing system of military state capitalism at home. If we were to withdraw the consent of the governed, as I think we should, we're withdrawing our consent to have these men and the interests they represent govern and manage American society and impose their concept of world order and their criteria for legitimate political and economic development in much of the world. Although an immense effort of propaganda and mystification is carried on to conceal these facts, nonetheless facts they remain. We have today the technical and material resources to meet man's animal needs. We have not developed the cultural and moral resources or the democratic forms of social organization that make possible the humane and rational use of our material wealth and power. Conceivably, the classical liberal ideals, as expressed and developed in their libertarian socialist form, are achievable. But if so, only by a popular revolutionary movement rooted in wide strata of the population and committed to the elimination of repressive and authoritarian institutions, state and private. To create such a movement is the challenge we face and must meet if there's to be an escape from contemporary barbarism. Thank you.